So my presentation is on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and I'm just going to start with some background on the issue itself. So in Ireland as a whole, British had control over it since basically the 16th century. They had a strong control over Ireland. And in the 18th century, Irish nationalism really started emerging, and the Irish wanted independence from Britain. After the First World War is when the Republic of Ireland was created. So under the Government of Ireland Act in 1920, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland were separated. So Northern Ireland was established, and they were a self-governing region of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland was their own independent country. So the main issue is between Protestant and Catholic in the Troubles. That was pretty much the main division. So the Protestants were aligned a lot with the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland was pretty Protestant at the time, and the Republic of Ireland was very Catholic, though some Catholics still lived in Northern Ireland. And the Protestants were the majority, and they produced a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, which fueled a lot of early disputes between the two. And so because of where the Catholics settled in their neighborhoods in Northern Ireland, there was a lot of gerrymandering, and their votes were diluted due to gerrymandering because they were grouped into a constituency. And this was done by the United Kingdom. And so this also fueled like early disputes between the two groups. And basically there were two parties or two groups, and it was the Unionists and the Nationalists. And so the Unionists wanted to stay with the United Kingdom, and they were mainly Protestants, where the Nationalists wanted to become a part of the Republic of Ireland, and they were mainly Catholic. So in 1966 was when the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was founded, and it was hoped to diminish Catholic discrimination. And at many of their marches, a lot of violence broke out, and so that was kind of the beginning. And then in 1968 is when the Troubles were actually said to have started in a Republican army, and it was a group of nationalists. So they were the ones to really begin a lot of the protests and the violence because they felt as though there was anti-Catholic sentiment towards them. And so they began to riot and protest. One of the earliest protests broke out in August of 1969, and it's called the Battle of Bogside, and 8 civilians died in it. During a lot of their protests, the casualties were civilians and not necessarily soldiers, which makes this a really different from any type of normal war that you would think of. So the London government attempted to defuse these nationalists in the IRA, and it really did not work. They tried to create reforms, but it frequently just turned into violence instead. And so from 1971 to 1974, 170 people died. And as I said, they were mainly civilians who were dying in battle or in these protests. So some larger events that occurred during the 70s, which is when a lot of the early war or battles were occurring. Some of these included the Ballymurphy shootings, the Spring Hill shootings, the McGurk pub bombing, and they all occurred in the 70s. And another really important event that occurred in the 70s was Bloody Sunday. So Bloody Sunday happened in Londonderry, which was a really conflicted neighborhood. And some people, the nationalists called it Derry, where the loyalists or the unionists called it Londonderry. So IRA protesters took to the streets to show opposition to a new British rule, which basically allowed people to get interned without trial. And so during this massacre, 14 Catholics were killed by the British military. And this is just a picture of the Bloody Sunday massacre in Northern Ireland at the time. And there was no apology that actually came out until 2010. So the nationalists were really upset by this, and they were really upset by this, and it really fueled their fire in their cause. So basically, after 6 years of fighting, there was an attempt at some sort of peace, which was the Sunningdale Agreement. So it outlined the idea of a power share between the Unionists and the Nationalists, and it obviously was unsuccessful. The Nationalists rioted against it, and they were not happy with the content of it. So Obviously, after this, there became no ceasefire, and there were still a lot of tension between the two groups. Specifically for the civilians who were even just living through this, it was really, their neighborhoods were really dangerous. So I mentioned Derry and Londonderry. So Belfast was another neighborhood that was really segregated. And so they segregated these neighborhoods into separate divided areas between the Catholics and the Protestants. And at these divides, there were things such as barbed wires and usually soldiers who were armed. And the people who attempted to cross these lines at all ran the risk of being shot at, even if there was no reason for them to be shooting. And so, again, this shows how the bystanders were really affected in the Troubles. Another really important event that happened during the Troubles in the early 80s was the nationalist hunger strikes. So it really occurred in 1981. So it was hunger strikes in prison. Basically, prisoners of war were turned into prisoners of crime. And they went on hunger strikes in the prisons. One in particular, Bobby Sands, died in prison because of starvation. And this really fueled the fire again under the nationalists, because after the Sunningdale Agreement, they just kind of lost their hope. And then following this with the hunger strikes, they really were reinvigorated, causing kind of like a new part of the Troubles to start forming. During the 80s, the nationalists actually started using Libyan weapons that were provided by the Libyan dictator. So they were seeking outside help. And they also sought and found a lot of support for the movement with Irish Americans, although the United States was obviously in the Cold War during this period, so they were not helping them directly, but they found a lot of support with Irish Americans across the sea. And during the 80s, they also took a lot of new strategies. They attempted to bomb and kill the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, and it was unsuccessful, but they did a lot of bombings during this period, and eventually the Anglo-Irish Agreement was drafted in 1985. And so basically in this agreement, it was really a predecessor to the Good Friday Agreement, which is the eventual pact agreement that ended or started the ceasefire to the Troubles. But in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, the people of Northern Ireland were given the ability to vote themselves into the Republic of Ireland if they had a majority vote. And so even despite this agreement, the fighting continued. And as I said, it built a lot of the foundations for the Good Friday Agreement, which eventually ended the Troubles. And another thing that really influenced the end of the Troubles was the Cold War. The ending of the Cold War influenced Troubles greatly because there was a new sense of peace, the want for peace. And so this influenced a lot of the nationalists and unionists to find peace with the Good Friday Agreement. So the Good Friday Agreement was signed on April 10th, 1998. And again, as I said, it played off the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So it was had the same idea that if the people of Northern Ireland wanted to vote to be into the Republic of Ireland, they could, as long as they had the majority of votes. And again, it kind of plays off the Sunningdale Agreement as well, because there was a power share between the two parties, the Unionists and the Nationalists. So there are two branches. They have the legislature and the executive. And in the executive body, there's a first minister and a deputy first minister. And usually a unionist is chosen as the first minister, while a nationalist is the deputy first minister. And in the executive branch, the legislature, there were 90 popular elected officials. And so in this, the unionists and the nationalists both have some representation so that neither group overpowers the other, which was a really important thing in this agreement for both sides to agree to it. So because of this new agreement, a lot of the power of Northern Ireland had to be transitioned from London to Belfast, because Belfast was the new center for the Northern Ireland government. So a lot of the powers had to be transitioned, but London stopped this devolution to Belfast in 2002, and the two countries actually had to reconvene to create what is called the St. Andrews Agreement. So the St. Andrews Agreement basically just defines the power share between the two main groups again. So basically define the difference between Sinn Féin, which is the Nationalist Party, and the Democratic Unionist Party. And it created the North-South Ministerial Council, which is NSMC, and it was basically for the Republic of Ireland to develop some consultation with Northern Ireland in order for them to stay in contact and help each other out. And it was not actually until the mid 2010s that the devolution process was pretty much complete. It took a really long time due to kind of like the stop and go and the reconvening between the UK or Britain and Northern Ireland. And in the St. Andrews Agreement, it really was just an extension of the Good Friday Agreement. So it contained all the same information and just went a little bit farther in order to really define the two parties and their place with each other. So I focused mainly on the effects of the Troubles in Northern Ireland because it's obvious that, as I said, the process of devolution didn't stop until the mid-2010s, and this really took a toll on their international relations and their country as a whole, and it's something that's still really being processed. So one thing that had taken a great toll during the Troubles and even afterwards is the gross domestic product of Northern Ireland. So over the course of the Troubles, the gross domestic product went down by 10%. And if you take out the grants that Northern Ireland had received because of the Troubles, it was about a total of a 15 to 20% fall in their GDP. So this negative impact has been present for years to come, and it still hasn't fully recovered. And yeah, the killings of by the Republicans really greatly impacted the GDP. So this plays a great role on Northern Ireland because, as we see, like throughout history, the trend of a falling GDP usually calls for some sort of a recession or an unemployment, basically just an overall decline in the quality of life for many people. They decreased the amount of trade that Northern Ireland could do, obviously because they weren't producing as much as they were before the Troubles. And so it's both bad nationally and internationally. It has national effects, obviously, on the people and the citizens of Northern Ireland because they saw unemployment, but also it just decreases the amount of trade a country can do, and it really decreased their stability both nationally and internationally. So my next effect that I researched was something that is called memory wars, which basically is the national view on what happened within the Troubles. And there were a lot of differing opinions on it because the Sinn Féin really felt like they should be the victim of the Troubles and that the UK was kind of the antagonist. So basically in Northern Ireland, there's the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, which is the main unionist party. There's also other parties such as the UUP, which is the Ulster Unionist Party, but the DUP has the majority. And then there's Sinn Féin, which is the Nationalist Party. And so after the Troubles, there was a really competing sense of victimhood between the two, and they saw their troubles through their own lens and didn't really try to see what the other side was, where they were coming from. And so they have memory wars, which is really, it restricts Northern Ireland from maintaining internal peace because both groups have a lot of animosity towards each other. So even in the youth of Ireland, you can see a really big divide between the two parties. And so parties, as I said, remember the war differently. So one of the main issues that kind of shows this is the McGuinness issue. So McGuinness was First Minister from 2007 to 2017, and he was a member of the IRA during the Troubles. And so during his time as First Minister, he worked to make a lot of agreements between Sinn Féin and the DUP. And during his time, that was his time in office, and he really tried to reconcile between the two parties. But the DUP kind of saw him as a radical, and they shamed him for his work in the IRA, kind of erasing the other parts of his accomplishments as First Minister, which Sinn Féin thought should really be celebrated, and they saw him almost as a hero. And so there was a huge competing like idea on who he was that really kind of represents the total issue of Memory Wars, I think. And as I said, there was a huge effect on the youth. So less than 10% of students today in Northern Ireland actually attend an integrated religious school. So most children attend either a Catholic or Protestant school throughout their entire life, from grade school and up. So because of this, there's a lot of separation still. And the parents who lived through the Troubles really pass on these views to their children, which is really kind of almost unique to Northern Ireland because it's so separated. And in addition to this, there's also something that is peace walls that are in Northern Ireland and throughout some certain neighborhoods, and they continue to actually separate the Protestant and the Catholics. So there's a really small chance of interaction between the two groups present from childhood. Like, no kid really interacts with people outside of their religion in a lot of cases, which is really interesting because the Troubles obviously ended over 2 decades ago, and it's really present still in their lives. This is a picture of a peace wall that's in Derry, and it's an image of the peace walls that were up because of the Troubles and that are still there today. And moreover, the youth tend to have less grievance towards the IRA and the party of Sinn Féin because they didn't actually live through the Troubles, and they didn't really see the destruction that happened. And there's been research that shows that they have less grievance just in general towards the IRA, which was very interesting. So these memory wars have actually had some great effects on Northern Ireland itself and its government. So in 2017, there was a renewable heat scandal, which was with McGuinness, as I said, who was the first minister from 2007 to 2017. So in 2017, he actually resigned from his position because of this scandal. And the power sharing agreement was already volatile throughout the 2 decades because the Good Friday Agreement was debated and the devolution had been stopped time and again. So it was already very volatile, and it actually caused the government to fall apart. And so after he resigned, there was no first minister, and there was the lack of the Sinn Féin party being in the executive branch. And it really completely stalled their government, and their internal government really was completely broken apart. And so this did not get fixed until January 2020. So it was about 3 years until Northern Ireland had reestablished their government. They did so with the New Decade, New Approach document. And again, as we saw kind of with the St. Andrews Agreement, was pretty much just a recommitment to the Good Friday Agreement. It was the Good Friday Agreement all over again, but with a new commitments to it from both sides. And they wanted a greater cooperation between the Northern Ireland Executive and the United Kingdom government. And again, it talked about the NSMC to help complete and establish projects for the citizens with the help of the Republic of Ireland. So the country really struggled internally, and they were kind of like a sitting duck. They didn't really have an official government, and they really couldn't play in the international field. And they were reliant on civil servants that were trying to keep the country alive on short resources because obviously the government was completely put on hold. And it really showed some of the lasting effects of the volatility of the Good Friday Agreement and the Troubles because their government was completely shut down for basically 3 years. Currently, probably the most crazy thing that is going on in Northern Ireland right now is with Brexit, which obviously occurred back in 2016 when they voted on it, and it hasn't really been official till just recently. There was a big question of what's going to happen to Northern Ireland. How will the Good Friday Agreement be impacted? So obviously from Brexit, the UK is not in the EU anymore, but Northern Ireland, they voted to remain in the EU by 56%, but because as the UK was taken as a whole. So with the Britain, Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, their vote was 52% in favor of leaving the EU. So for the UK, Europe is their biggest trade market, and obviously we know that within the EU, goods and services can be transported across the member states, and they didn't have to be checked, which made trade just in general much easier. And this decision was made in hopes of expanding trade with other countries and being in larger markets, and it was mainly for Britain, but it came really troubling to Northern Ireland. So just as the Northern Ireland government was being kind of reconvened in January of 2020 was when Brexit really officially occurred. The funding of Northern Ireland came a lot from the EU. They were receiving around $780 million a year to complete various projects. So this was a concern of theirs. But specifically in January 2021 was when the Northern Ireland Protocol was announced. So it basically helped establish how Brexit affected this kind of unique situation. So in this protocol, Northern Ireland actually still follows a lot of the EU rules despite Brexit, but it has a regulatory border between themselves and Great Britain, where only certain goods are checked, depending on Article 16, which pretty much stated all the rules of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And it was mainly on trade and the flow and movement of goods. The Northern Ireland Protocol really helped to kind of establish Northern Ireland's role in Brexit, and they can vote to keep these new trade rules in another 4 years. So there's been more complications within Brexit. It was a huge effect on Northern Ireland. So some people, especially the Unionists, were nervous that with having some sort of autonomy that they could want to leave, renewing these old differences that really occurred between the Unionists and the Nationalists. And the Nationalists are feeling as they have like a renewed sense of hope and want to reunite with the Republic of Ireland. Additionally, there's a chance that leaving the EU's single market could result in a loss of up to 40,000 jobs. It's really dangerous to the agriculture economy of Northern Ireland, and the EU single market made trade extremely easy, and so that can really affect the people of Northern Ireland and their unemployment rates, which has already been damaged by the troubles through their GDP. Another interesting toll that Brexit has taken on Northern Ireland is the idea of passports. So basically, Northern Irish citizens can choose to have a British passport as well because they're a part of the UK. And so there's a question of, will the Northern Irish citizens still be able to have a British passport? And if they do, how will this affect their movement between different countries? With the Irish passport, obviously they still are part of, the Republic of Ireland is still a part of the EU. And so citizens with an Irish passport can use the EU lanes at airports, are free to move within the countries in the EU. They don't have to have a visa to work or live in other countries that are a part of the European Union. But with Brexit, people with British passports are now unable to do these activities. So it's unsure how this will really play a role with the Northern Irish citizens. But it's something that could potentially cause major issues. Additionally, while in January 2020, the government was kind of reinstated, it's still really rocky, and there's a lot of issues within Belfast. So there's concern that with Brexit and with the leave of the EU, that the London or Britain can really kind of take over the government in Northern Ireland, which would obviously be an issue. And there's also issues with the United States within Brexit, because Trump encouraged Brexit. And he really ignored the U.S. want for peace, because the United States is really behind keeping the peace in Northern Ireland and following the Good Friday Agreement. Obviously, with Brexit, there could be huge effects on the Good Friday Agreement, and it was just really concerning that the United States, which follows and wants to follow the Good Friday Agreement and keep that intact, was almost in a way endangering the ability for the Good Friday Agreement to maintain its place. So there's a lot of different views on Brexit within Northern Ireland. It really increased the already existent tensions. The Nationalists did see it as a way to potential unification, because they're kind of in almost still following some of the EU rules, especially from the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so they think it's almost a way for unification, because it's kind of refueling the nationalist cause again, and it could be potential way for them to unify with the Republic of Ireland. Another main issue that people are thinking of in Northern Ireland is funding. While Northern Ireland does receive some funding from outside of the EU, a lot of their funding was coming directly from the EU. And so some of their projects and their international relations with other countries have been put on hold because they simply don't have as much money and or as funding as they were receiving when they were in the EU. So for the Unionists, they really dislike the Northern Ireland Protocol, because they see the Northern Irish Protocol as kind of taking them away from the UK, because they're still following a lot of the European Union rules and a lot of the trade rules in the European Union, and they really don't like this. They kind of want to be a real part of the United Kingdom, and they don't kind of want to be half in, half out. They want to be completely a part of the United Kingdom and following all the same rules as the United Kingdom follows. So, there's a couple more effects that I just wanted to talk about. So because of the Troubles and following the Troubles, a lot of Northern Ireland's relations with other countries really revolve around keeping the peace and keeping the Good Friday Agreement intact for Northern Ireland, which almost is a downside to them, because all of their relations with other countries are focusing still on the Troubles. It's really the main central idea of almost everything that Northern Ireland does, which can make it really hard for them to get involved elsewhere internationally. And so, for example, the United States, as I said before, their main goal is to keep the peace. And there was the establishment of the International Fund for Ireland, which is also funded by other countries, but specifically with the United States. The U.S. government has provided $544 million to the United States since the IFI was actually created. And this money is really necessary for them to stay afloat as a country, especially now following Brexit, where they're losing the funding from the EU. And Northern Ireland really needs the funding. As we saw, their GDP has gone down, and as a country, they're still struggling and reeling from the impacts of the Troubles. So this reliance really complicates the desires of the Nationalist Party and the nationalist movement, because although nationalists are still want unification, that's still their main goal. The peace would really have to be broken, and the Good Friday Agreement would have to be broken. And if that was the case, then I think then a lot of the funding from other countries in the IFI would be halted. So it's almost impossible for the nationalists to support their cause anymore, because all of their international relations and their funding comes from keeping peace. And it's really impossible for the nationalists to keep peace while also seeking unification, as we've seen throughout Northern Ireland's history with the Troubles. It was pretty much impossible. So this idea that all of Northern Ireland's relations revolve around keeping peace really puts the country in a bad place. They're very stuck. They're stuck to the UK. They're stuck within their international affairs. And obviously every citizen is still stuck in their views, and they still are a nationalist or a unionist. Every party, both parties are still very strict. And this really stalls the advancement of Northern Ireland in the larger global playing field of politics. The Troubles have just in general plagued Northern Ireland, and will probably continue to do so for some time. It was a completely different type of warfare, if you can even call it war, where it was protests and violence in the streets and a lot of civilian casualties. And there was constant death, and there was a huge emotional impact during the Troubles. And even as I said as I've showed you, to this day, Northern Ireland really struggles to keep their government alive. Their government was completely broken for pretty much 3 years. And now, after that, there's Brexit, which is completely complicating their country and their status more. And fueling the fires between the Unionists and the Nationalists. The Northern Irish really have no identity, and future remains completely uncertain. As I said, the neighborhoods are completely divided, the schools are segregated, there's really no attempt to fix the conflict between the two parties of the Sinn Féin and the DUP. And they've been torn apart even more so. Their economy is dangling on a string, and everything is kind of complicating their situation more. And so that's why I wanted to focus on the effects of the Troubles, because while the war itself, as we saw, took about 3,500 casualties, the effects have been so much greater and so much more prolonged than I think was really expected. And so that's my presentation on the Troubles in Northern Ireland.